When we talk about the Exodus, perhaps one of the most overlooked details is the route of the Exodus itself. The Exodus, the travel itinerary that is, can give us a lot of important details about the timing and the historical context of the narrative. The Exodus begins at the city of Piramesses, and that's going to be the first city we talk about here. Now, Piramesses was actually an island year-round. It was right smack dab in the middle of the Pelusiac branch of the Nile. And it was located 2 kilometers away from Avaris. It was also the imperial capital of Egypt. The Bible mentions that Pithom and Ramses contained storage cities that were built by the Israelites. And we have some idea what those storage cities looked like. They're very, very similar to these mud brick silos that we find today at the Ramesseum. But the city of Ramses is also noted as being the starting place for the Exodus. And in most likelihood, the Israelites actually gathered in the fields just south of the city of Piramesses in a sort of staging area between Avaris and Piramesses. Now, Piramesses is sort of unique. Piramesses means House of Ramses, and it's the only city from the ancient world that had that name. The city was originally founded by Seti I as a royal residence, but it was then rechristened as the House of Ramses when Ramses II made the city his official capital. Papyrus Anastasis VI, which dates to the 3rd year of Merneptah, who happens to be Ramses II's successor, names the city according to the full titulary of his father. The Egyptian kings originally built Ramses for 2 reasons. First, they wanted to keep an eye on the local Semitic population. But they also built Ramses because it also happened to be the tribal ancestral home of the Ramesside clan. So this was also, the land of Goshen was not only where the Israelites lived, but it was also where the House of Ramses had its power base for Ramses II. It was where he grew up. It was where his grandfather was governor and had his traditional homeland. So this is a very, very important area for the Ramessides. At the end of Dynasty 18 into early Dynasty 19, there was an overlap between the cities of Avaris and Piramesses. The 2 cities actually coexisted at the same time for a short period of time. So as towards the end of the timing of Avaris and into the beginning of the existence of Piramesses, both cities existed simultaneously. Ground-penetrating radar surveys done in 2003, 1996, and 2008 revealed that there was nothing under the foundation of Piramesses. So we know that the first occupation at Piramesses occurred during the reign of Seti I. These facts ultimately revealed 2 things. The first thing they revealed was that the Israelites lived near, but not in Piramesses. The second fact that it reveals is that the Exodus could not have occurred any earlier than the reign of Ramses II. Now, when the Israelites leave off after they gather in that staging area at Piramesses, Avaris ceases to be a viable city. A small part of it continues on, especially the port, until the end of Dynasty 20. but the major sort of occupied area of Avaris is abandoned. And Piramesses itself is eventually abandoned by 1070 BC. Now, to put this into perspective, 1070 BC is about 50 years before King Saul makes it to the throne. What's so interesting about this is a city that no longer exists by the Davidic kingdom. So by the time of King David, King Solomon, and the other kings of Israel, Piramesses is no longer a capital city. Piramesses doesn't exist anymore. It is completely replaced by the city of Tanis. So it's very, very interesting that the name Piramesses survives into the Pentateuch and comes down to us today in these texts. Okay, that was the first city of the Exodus, Piramesses. Now we go on to the second one, Succoth. The Torah states that Succoth was the next stop after leaving Egypt. Exodus 13:20, Numbers 33:6-7. Now, some scholars point to the similarity between modern Arabic name Tel el-Maskuta and Succoth. And there is an etymological link between the two, which we will discuss in a moment. The only problem is that Tel el-Maskuta is east of Tel el-Rataba, which is identified as Pithom. So this doesn't actually make a lot of sense that the Israelites would go east, come west, and then go east again. So what exactly is going on here? The Hebrew word Succoth is actually related to Sukkot, which means booths, as in the Feast of Sukkot. As such, Succoth may have actually been a temporary location or campsite, in other words, a way station with limited water and resources. However, in Papyrus Anastasis VI, the text says, quote, "We have finished letting the Shasu tribes of Edom pass the fortress of the House of Merneptah, life, prosperity, and health, which is in Tjeku, to the pools of Pithom of Merneptah, which are in Tjeku, in order to sustain them and sustain their flocks by the pleasure of Pharaoh, life, prosperity, and health." Now, this is a very interesting text for a number of reasons. According to the text, the Shasu pass by the fortress of Merneptah, which is in Tjeku, and then they go to Pithom, which is also in Tjeku. The fact is that this seems to indicate that Tjeku was a larger region than just indicated by one town. Now, there's an etymological link here between Tjeku and Succoth that's not immediately obvious. The fact is that many Egyptian words transliterate the T as an S. Tjeku is etymologically tied to Succoth, because the T converts to an S and the K remains. We see this actually happen in another place in this itinerary, which is the Sea of Reeds, which is Yam Suf in Hebrew, but the Patufi in Egyptian. So this is not uncommon. This happens. So what we are actually seeing here is probably that Succoth is a reference to Tjeku, but it is a reference to Tjeku as they entered the Wadi Tumilat, which is where the region of Tjeku is. So the reference to Succoth is probably the Israelites entering from the west and then moving eastward across the Wadi Tumilat. So where the Israelites encamped was probably near the modern town of Abu Hamad. So we should then understand that Tjeku is more or less similar to Goshen. It's not the name of a city. It is it's a regional name. And they are counting this as they make their way across the Wadi Tumilat. So that covers Succoth. After Succoth, the Israelites go to their third destination, which is Pithom. Pithom is located right in the center of the Wadi Tumilat, at a site called Tel El Rataba. Pithom held one of the storage cities that the Israelites were credited of having built out of mud brick. In ancient times, the road between Pithom and Piramesses was probably about 65 kilometers or 40 miles, and was approximately the equivalent of 2 days' travel. During the Old Kingdom and First Intermediate period, Pithom was a very, very popular destination for Levantine Asiatics that were immigrating into Egypt. They would slip into Egypt through the Wadi Tumilat because that afforded an opportunity for the Levantines to pasture their sheep, their flocks, as they traveled through. And during the Second Intermediate period, the Wadi Tumilat and Pithom had a rather substantial Asiatic population. Now, during the early New Kingdom, Dynasty 18, the population of Pithom declines, and it only is sparsely occupied during that period. But what happens in Dynasty 19 is Ramses II rebuilds the fortifications at Pithom, and he adds to those fortifications a temple. He erects a temple to the creator god Atum. This christens the town with a new name, Per Atum, the House of Atum. This is where Pithom, Per Tum, P-Tum, gets its name, from the temple that Ramses II built at Tjeku. Now, ultimately, the city of Pithom falls into disuse during the Saite period, and then is finally abandoned. But it's interesting because it gives us one of those cultural markers. Because we know that the name of this particular town was Peratum and its history that it was built by Ramses II, we can date the naming of this city. So that covers the city of Pithom, also called Etham. So if you see Etham and Pithom, they're the same city. The only difference is that Etham has dropped the P. The fourth city on the itinerary is Pi-Hahiroth. After the Israelites leave Pithom, they exit the Wadi Tumilat, but they do something very, very odd. They turn back, and instead of going south, they go north. And they camp before this little town called Pi-Hahiroth in Exodus 14:2. Now, the origin of Pi-Hahiroth comes from an Egyptian name, Per-Hut-Heret, and we find it in Papyrus Anastasis VI. Quote, "The Sea of Reeds comes to the papyrus reeds, and of the waters of Horus to rushes, twigs of the orchards and wreaths of the vineyards, birds from the cataract legion. It leans upon the sea, with begfish and burryfish, and even their hinterlands provided. The great of Victory's youths are in festive attire every day. Sweet moringa oil is upon their heads, having hair freshly braided. They stand beside their doors. their hands bowed down with foliage and greenery of Pi-Hahiroth, and flax of the waters of Horus. The day that one enters Piramesses, life, prosperity, and health, Montu of the two lands. This document locates Pi-Hahiroth on the way from the Sea of Reeds, which is the Patufi, to the capital, which was Piramesses. And so it appears that Pi-Hahiroth was on the southern coast of the Pelusiac estuary. So this indicates that it was sort of a marshy region on the edge of the desert. And while no one knows exactly where Pi-Hahiroth was, it is probably in very, very close proximity to Migdol and Baal-Zephon, two other towns we are going to examine. The fifth town on the itinerary is Baal-Zephon. After the Israelites camped at Pi-Hahiroth, they wandered into the wilderness near the fortress of Migdol. They camped between Migdol, Pi-Hahiroth, and the sea, and a looking post known as Baal-Zephon. Now, the place Baal-Zephon has a Semitic etymology. The word Baal comes from the Semitic name meaning Lord, and it's a theophoric name, and it often refers to the Canaanite storm god Hadad or Adad. But Baal was also worshipped at Avaris. It was worshipped by the Hyksos, who connected it to the Egyptian storm god Seth. And in Papyrus Salier 4, it's very interesting to note that the name Baal-Zephon is written with that Seth character. So we can see that even in the Ramesside period when these texts were written, that tie between Baal and Seth still remains even long after the Hyksos were exiled from Egypt and destroyed. Now, the other half of the name Baal-Zephon is very interesting too. That term Zaphon. In Semitic languages, it tends to mean the north. But in the Amarna letters, it is also the name of a specific city in the Levant. So we cannot be exactly sure what the name Baal-Zephon means. It could mean either Baal of the North, Lord of the North, or it could mean Lord of Zaphon, the name of a city. So we find one reference to this minor outpost in the Egyptian texts. It's another interesting thing that has survived from the 19th dynasty. So that covers Baal-Zephon. The sixth city in the itinerary we're going to examine is Migdol. After the Israelites fled Pharaoh, they took the Wadi Tumalot and, according to Exodus 14:1, doubled back. So they moved northward from Pi-Hahiroth against the sea in Migdol, Exodus 14:2. Now, Migdol was one of those fortresses on the Way of Horus, and the Way of Horus is a road along the north coast of the Sinai near the Mediterranean. It was a string of fortresses that controlled the flow of Asiatics in and out of Egypt. And these fortresses in the 19th dynasty were heavily fortified and contained garrisons of chariots. We find Migdol in the map of Seti I at Karnak. Unfortunately, that map is now destroyed, but it was recorded by Sir Alan Gardner. And we know that Migdol was placed between Charu, which was the first major border fort, and the dwelling of the lion. Now, we know where the dwelling of the lion is, because that has been discovered, and it was discovered by James Hoffmeyer and is located at the site of Tel El Borg. So it is probably Migdol is probably along the southern tip of the ancient lagoon in that estuary. The Egyptian word for Migdol is Maktir, and it comes directly from that Semitic word Migdol, meaning tower. And while its location is unknown, we do find it mentioned in several extra-biblical sources. Papyrus Anastasis V implies that Migdol was originally constructed by Seti I. However, it has been reconstructed several times in its history, and as it was being rebuilt, it changed locations. Eleazar Oren found a Roman period version of Migdol which lacked Ramesside remains. And besides the relief of Seti I at Karnak, there is this big, beautiful relief of Migdol found at Medina Habu, ascribed to a Migdol of Ramses II. So there is plenty of textual and relief evidence for Migdol dating to the Ramesside period, Seti I and Ramses II. So that covers the city of Migdol. This brings us to the seventh and final location that we're going to discuss in today's video, the Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds. Now, the Sea of Reeds appears to be one of the massive lakes that was part of the estuary system of the Pelusiac branch of the Nile. The translation of the Yam Suf as the Red Sea comes into our English Bibles through the Septuagint, which translates it as Erythrothalassa, or Red Sea. However, in the Hebrew, Yam Suf actually has the meaning of Sea of Reeds. Yam being the Semitic word for sea. Now, Suf is a very, very interesting word because it is also an Egyptian loanword. It was actually not a Semitic word. It came into Hebrew from Egyptian, the Egyptian being tuf. Tuf, or tufi, meaning reeds in Egyptian. Hebrew takes the T, converts it to an S, and makes it into Suf. And we find Suf being used in other places too. Like, for example, in the basket scene with the baby Moses. Moses is put into a basket made of Suf reeds. And then he's put in that basket and put into the river amongst the reeds. Again, Suf. So we see that theme of the reeds repeated in the baby Moses and in finally the parting of the Reed Sea, the Yam Suf. Now, the place Yam Suf also appears in Egyptian records. We've already actually seen it once in Papyrus Anastasis III, where it calls that body of water both the Pa-Tufi, the reeds, and the Pa-Yam, the sea. So we already have some idea where it is located, and that it's roughly located around Pi-Hahiroth, Baal-Zephon, Migdol, and upon departing, you end up at Piramesses. We also find it in another text as well, which is the onomastica of Amenhotep. In the geographical section of that onomasticon, we find a reference to the Yam Suf, which happens to be in a geographical order. That Onomastica lists the geographical order as Piramesses, the Payam, and then Charu, that first northern border fortress on the Way of Horus. So from all this textual evidence, we know that the Sea of Reeds, the Yam Suf, had to be in the northwestern Sinai area, at the estuary of the Pelusiac branch of the Nile. Furthermore, when Papyrus Anastasis VI mentions the three toponyms that we have already discussed, Piramesses, Pi-Hahiroth, and the Sea of Reeds, it does so in an order that is really, really similar to what we find in the biblical texts, but in reverse order. So Papyrus Anastasis III outlays what the journey would be like going from the Sea of Reeds to Piramesses, whereas the Exodus text gives us the opposite. What's the journey like from Piramesses to the Sea of Reeds? It's a very, very strong correlation of physical geography. Overall, the itinerary of the Exodus relies upon local knowledge. And people isolated in Babylon would not have been familiar with either the details of this itinerary, this local geography, nor the ancient names. Many of the names found in this itinerary fall out of favor by the Iron Age. They're no longer used. Piramesses is extinct as a city, even before Saul becomes to the throne. Pithom ceases to be a viable city by the 7th century BC. These ancient and minor towns would have been quickly forgotten if this had been an oral history that had been passed down. One of the things that I think is really, really important about the itinerary of the Exodus is that it gives us not just strong evidence that there really was a historical Exodus, but it gives us also a strong indication that the texts themselves were committed to paper very early on. These are details that just didn't last. They didn't survive antiquity. And in many cases, they didn't even survive the Iron Age. So I think this is probably the most important aspect of the itinerary of the Exodus, is it gives us really, really strong evidence for the reliability of the Exodus tradition. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.